Congrats, you found the property you like, you've negotiated a great deal, and now you're officially under contract. At this point, if you've ever seen any of the $1 Million Listings or HGTV shows, you might often hear them use the term opened escrow. Here in Illinois, we use slightly different terminology, but they mean essentially the same thing. We say that you've opened up the attorney review and inspection period, also known as AI. Illinois is an attorney state, which means that in any real estate transaction, you as a buyer and the seller will both be represented by a real estate attorney. Your attorney, just like your lender and realtor, are going to help guide you through the home purchase process. However, they're going to do it a little bit more from a legal lens. They will help make sure that you are protected as you take ownership of your new home. Let's go sit down with Kristen Duffy of Duffy Law to chat about what happens once you go under contract.
So at this point of the process, you've gone under contract, you have an accepted offer from the seller. I'm sitting here today with Kristen Duffy of Duffy Law, and she's gonna help walk us through what happens next. Kristen, what happens once a buyer goes under contract?
Well, once the buyer goes under contract, I usually will get the executed contract right away, and then from there I pull all the public records, so property tax records, assessments, any of the building violations, permits, and then I review all of those documents while the buyer is working with you and your team and doing an inspection. And while I'm looking at those documents, I'm really looking to see what the assessed value is, whether the tax proration credit is adequate within the contract, and then if there are any permits or inspections that maybe haven't been passed yet on the property that then I want to bring to the buyer's attention. From there, I'll set up a drafted letter. It'll have any proposed modifications to the contract that I think are best to protect the buyer's interest. And then I'll wait for the buyer to inform me about the results of the inspection, which they'll work through with you.
Perfect. So what is the attorney review process? What is it there for?
Well, the attorney review process is really there to help navigate all of the legal jargon that's within the contract and to have almost like a cooling off period for the buyer and the seller, because there's a lot of negotiations going on during that process with you and the other real estate agent, and people are really excited, but then there's this, typically it's a 5 business day window that then the buyer or the seller either party has an opportunity to work with their attorney to then, in a calm setting, really look at the contract and decide, is this something that truly that they were interested in or that they understood every single term. So really at the time when they're just looking at the property and that they know that they want to enter into the contract, the most important part is make sure you have your purchase price correct. If you're good at the purchase price, everything else in that contract should be able to be modified through the attorney review period.
Awesome. And what are some of the biggest questions that you get from buyers during this time? Outside of the inspection, of course. What are some of the things that you're focusing on most?
Primarily, it's tax prorations, because here in Illinois, we do taxes in arrears, so they're paying them 1 year behind. And that's very confusing for people, so you do need to get an appropriate tax credit at closing. So I spent a lot of time explaining that to the client. And then here in Cook County, we have a reassessment year. It's every 3 years, and that can really alter these taxes, the property taxes. So I spend a fair amount of time answering questions and just getting clients to be comfortable with the taxes.
And once we've gone through the inspection and we've outlined all of the potential asks that we have for the seller, how do we communicate that with them? What's the step for us to, within that 5 business day period, to move forward?
So then I will take my letter that I have drafted all the proposed modifications to the contract to, and then I'll incorporate any of our inspection requests, and I send that letter over to the seller's attorney. And then from there, then we'll just start either via phone or email with going over any of those proposed modifications. There's usually a little bit of back and forth. And another thing I do want to bring it to your attention, we're talking generally about what's important, but if it's a multi-unit, so if it's a 2-flat or a 3-flat, there's quite a bit of other things that clients are concerned about. So we're looking at leases. That would be something that I'm reviewing as well. Rent roll. There certainly can be lots of permit issues with 2-flats and 3-flats, so any multi-unit. And then with condos, I'm also looking at the association as well.
Once we've had that meeting of the minds between the seller and the buyer, and everybody's agreed to the modifications proposed, what happens next?
From there, both attorneys will sign off on the attorney review letter, and then that letter will end up being incorporated as the final terms into the contract. And from there, I'll then alert the buyer, you, and your team that the additional earnest money, if any, is due, and then the buyer will coordinate the delivery of the additional earnest money with your team and with the listing agent.
Perfect. And then from that point, we can move on to the next step.
So there are two really big steps that come next. One of them is certainly going to be if it's an association, and then we're going to have the condo review period. So that I will take all of the condo review documents, which are usually the 22.1 disclosure. It's got a budget, financial statements, declaration, rules and regulations. It's a lot of documents that many people become overwhelmed with. But I do review all of them, and some of those are going to be the financials, which are really important in order to be able to determine whether this is a healthy association. So as a CPA, I also will review them and then try to, in layman's term, explain to buyers what some of these figures actually mean and whether this is an association that is healthy for the buyer. It's a good investment. Sometimes there are some occasions where there are some red flags. Doesn't mean it's a bad property. It just means they need to evaluate given the purchase price that they're paying.
And we have, as buyers, a contingency built into the contract that essentially states 5 days after we received all the documents, we can review them, and if something glaring jumps out that causes concern, we have the right to cancel.
Yes. And within that, so I said that there's two main things. The other one is the survey. So if it's an association, so it's a condo, you want to still look at the survey. It's called a PLATA survey. That's part of the declaration. Really important to look at that, especially if you have roof rights, if you've got parking. Here in the city, the parking can get mixed up quite a bit. So it's really important to check that, and I always will highlight on the plat where the parking is, just to make sure that it's the parking space that was bargained for. Now, if it's a single family home, instead of that two-step process, you'll have just the survey itself, and the survey is still very, very important because now you're looking at your neighbors and the property itself to see if there's any encroachments, are there any easements that you should be aware of. So I'll review that and then again work with the buyer just to show where these lines are, the property lines, any encroachments, easements, and whatever else may be raised on the survey.
Nice. And after we've essentially okayed everything and after they've gotten their clear to close, it is essentially time for closing day. What happens on closing day?
So on closing day, the buyer should have had a final walkthrough. Sometimes it's the evening before, but they'll have the final walkthrough with your team, and then after that, they'll meet with me at the title company, and we'll have a big pile of papers. It's not as big if it's a cash transaction, but either way, we're always going to have a deed that I'll be reviewing with the buyer. A settlement statement, so that's all of the figures that I'll go over in detail, make sure that they know what they're paying for. There's quite a bit of fees that are involved. And then if there is a loan involved too, then I'll go over all of the loan documents, including the note, the mortgage, and then the application and whatever else the lender may need for funding.
And once they've signed their life away on all of those documents, they essentially, in a very anticlimactic fashion, get keys and take ownership.
Yes, so there's always 3 checks that need to be done when the lender's involved. So there's funding authorization is first with the seller's attorney, usually. Second, often with the buyer's attorney. So after I've reviewed all those documents, make sure that that is in fact what our client has bargained for, and the client's comfortable with the condition of the property and all of the money that's changing hands, then I'll give funding authorization. And then the final piece is usually the lender to review all of those signed documents, which usually are in pretty blue ink to show it's an original signature. And then if the lender is satisfied, then there will be funding authorization from the lender. And once you have those 3 check marks, then the buyer will officially become the owner.
Nice. You get keys.
Yes.